Good Monday morning. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. We begin with breaking news on the war in Ukraine. This morning, Russia announcing a temporary ceasefire and claiming they will allow people to flee the country following 11 days of heavy shelling. Russia's defense ministry claims its troops will hold fire and open humanitarian corridors in several major cities. But similar announcements in recent days did not hold. Also, some routes being offered only lead to Russia or its close ally, Belarus. Ukraine's vice prime minister calling the offer unacceptable and immoral and asking Russia to evacuate people through western Ukraine instead. This as the humanitarian crisis worsens in and around Ukraine. The UN says so far 1.5 million people have already fled the country, with many more still looking for a way out.
We are simple, ordinary people. We cannot get it. Why this is happening?
Today, a third round of talks is set to take place in Belarus. Well, this morning, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky makes a new plea for stronger sanctions against Russia and for NATO to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
In Ukraine, we always wanted peace. How many more deaths need to happen?
The impacts of the war now being felt here at home as gas prices across the U.S. soar to the highest levels in decades. We have team coverage this morning with national security expert Jason Beardsley, NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber at a refugee center in Poland, and NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter in Lviv, which is in western Ukraine. Molly, we're going to start with you this morning. Russia announced this ceasefire and the opening of these humanitarian corridors from several Ukrainian cities, but we understand some of these corridors only lead to Russia or to Belarus. Do we know if this ceasefire is being observed, and what does the Ukrainian government make of some of these corridor routes?
Yeah, Joe, that's right. Ceasefires, by definition, are not unilateral. So the Russian Ministry of Defense this morning announced that they were offering these humanitarian corridors only going to Belarus and Russia. Now, in the next couple of hours, we didn't hear much from the Ukrainians or the ICRC, the neutral body on the ground, which is facilitating and brokering those ceasefires. And then the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine said, absolutely no way. This is unacceptable. We are not sending our civilians who have been under Russian bombardment into Russia and Ukraine. Now, our understanding at this hour, Joe, is that the Ukrainians have countered. They have sent proposals back to the Russian side with humanitarian corridors heading to the west of the country where I am. Worth noting, though, of course, over the weekend, there were two apparently agreed ceasefires in the southeastern city of Mariupol. Both broke down within hours because of Russian shelling. Joe, I'll send it back to you.
Let's talk more about Mariupol. We saw multiple attempted ceasefire attempts there over the weekend. Ukraine has accused Russia of targeting civilians. Russia denies that. Tell us more about what happened there and what is the situation like there on the ground right now.
Right. So we've been talking to the ICRC over the weekend because their teams are on the ground in Mariupol. They started both Saturday morning and Sunday morning by starting to open up those humanitarian corridors. Their understanding was that locations had been agreed for civilians to depart out of the city. But they say that completely broke down, that the two sides hadn't actually decided on the exact route, hadn't actually decided on the exact departure points. And they say their team was out there when the fighting, when the shelling resumed. In order for a ceasefire to be effective, both sides have to be on the same side. They have to agree exactly the route, Joe. They have to agree exactly who gets to be evacuated. They also have to agree if humanitarian aid gets to come in. And in addition to Mariupol, we also saw evacuations in a northeastern suburb of Kyiv. It's called Irpin. We saw some very distressing video over the weekend. On Saturday, the Red Cross says 3,000 people got out of that suburb. Well, they tried to do the same on Sunday, but Russian forces shelled the exact location that they knew civilians were going to be evacuated from, Joe.
So many stunning images we're seeing right now on the screen, Molly, of people just trying to flee their towns as quickly as they can with whatever they can grab. Begs the question, what's happening with peace talks? Ukrainian leaders say another round of peace talks with Russia could come as early as today. These humanitarian corridors we've discussed did come out of the last round of negotiations. We know expectations are low with these talks, but what should we expect for this latest round, Molly?
Yeah, so our understanding right now, Joe, is that there are going to be peace talks starting at 4 o'clock local, so in about 2 hours. Same delegation, apparently, but I got to say, coming out of a weekend which did not result in the ceasefires that had been advertised. I'm not sure how much optimism we are going into today's peace talks with, but we will absolutely keep you posted, Joe.
All right, Molly Hunter in Lviv. Molly, thank you so much.
We're also covering the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Europe this morning. The UN estimates more than 1.5 million Ukrainians have already left the country since the Russian invasion began. With a temporary ceasefire in place and those humanitarian corridors opening up for civilians, that number is expected to climb. Nearly 900,000 refugees have fled to Poland alone so far. Over the weekend, Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited a welcome center on the Polish-Ukraine border. He met with the Ukrainian foreign minister and heard stories from displaced families. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joins us now from that welcome center. Hey, Ellison, good morning. So Secretary Blinken is the highest-ranking American diplomat to visit the region since this war began. Tell us a little bit about what he saw on his visit to that welcome center that I know you've been spending time at as well.
Yeah, well, one of the things he probably would have immediately heard is stories like we have heard, stories of families surviving, of making it here, but then trying to figure out where they go next. I want you to listen to what we heard from one woman. She is in her 60s. She fled from eastern Ukraine, her home, her community, heavily under attack. She made it here completely alone and was trying to figure out where to go next. Listen to what she told us.
I want the world to know that when they say in Russia that they are attacking only military objects, this is a lie. They are bombing residential areas. They're simply bombing the houses. They're bombing huge places, huge residential areas. There are no more houses because they're bombed. Near me, there is the area of students, the dormitories. 4 bombs were thrown on them from airplanes. When I was leaving, I had to take all my life in these bags. This is all my life. This is heartbreaking. It's not because I love things, but it's just, this is 68 years of my life in these bags. 1, 2, 3.
So, Savannah, we've been to 6 different border crossings, 6 different refugee welcome centers. This is by far the largest and one of the most organized. You can see people lining up here. There's a lot of volunteer efforts, food that way. You see all of these buses. What happens here is people come from where they crossed on the border. They're able to go inside, sit, sleep on a cot for a little while, get medical attention if needed, get food. There are some people from different embassies inside trying to help. Then these buses, someone will call out over an intercom where they're going, either other cities in Poland or sometimes as far away as Germany or Czech Republic. People then line up, they board that bus, and they make their way to their next destination. When we first started reporting on this and talking to refugees, a lot of them were coming to stay with family and friends they already had in Poland. Now we're meeting a lot of people like that woman who they don't know anyone in this country. They just knew they had to get somewhere safe, so they came here, and they're really trying to figure out next steps minute by minute. Savannah?
And it's been just so incredible to see the people of Poland, the people of all these neighboring countries, help them make those decisions, get them places, open up their homes. I mean, it's just pretty incredible. Ellison, we mentioned that temporary ceasefire that's supposedly in effect. Now, as we also mentioned, a lot of those routes are to Russia, to Belarus. But are you hearing from anyone there in that camp about that providing any relief or peace of mind? Are they getting that news? And does that make them feel any better about family or friends still in the country trying to get out?
You know, we talked to someone yesterday who said she'd been talking to friends who lived in some of those areas where there were supposed to be these humanitarian corridors, green zones. And she said what she was hearing from her friend's family, what she'd seen in her journey. She said it lasted maybe 50 minutes and then nothing, that it was back to how things were before. It is incredibly difficult for people, particularly coming from eastern Ukraine, to get somewhere safe. We hear stories of it taking hours, days for people to get across, stops along the way in bomb shelters, and then finally getting to Poland and having their first little bit of relief. moment of feeling safe for many people in the first time in 10 days. Savannah?
Allison Barber, thank you so much. Amazing reporting coming from you out of Poland.
Let's bring in national security expert Jason Beardsley. He's the National Executive Director for the Association of the U.S. Navy. Jason, good to have you with us. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he believes accusations that Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
We've seen very credible reports of deliberate attacks on civilians, which would constitute a war crime. We've seen very credible reports about the use of certain weapons.
So he's echoing what we're actually hearing from Ukrainians firsthand. If the U.S. believes the reports are credible, what should the U.S. do about it? What are the options?
Well, this is a pretty tough place that the United States has gotten itself into, because we've said very vociferously we are not putting troops into contact, and we're not going to enforce a no-fly zone. The most you've seen from the White House, and this has been a consistent message, is that we may supply some lethal munitions, or we may help in the humanitarian cause. But even once they come to the conclusion that there may be war crimes committed, the State Department doesn't have much wiggle room, based on what the White House has been saying, to do more than what they've already done. Sanctions, different things. But here's where they can start. We can start by stopping the purchase of Russian oil that's going on every day, and fueling what the Russians are doing on the ground. That'd be the first move that I would look for.
Here's something else happening that's sort of intriguing. The U.S. is exploring how to send Soviet-era fighter jets to Ukraine. Help us understand, what's the strategy behind this? Why not just send more modern American jets?
Well, this is a sort of an indirect sort of support. So Poland has offered to place Russian-era or Soviet-era MiGs in the hands of Ukrainians. What they would look for is the United States to guarantee backfilling those aircraft with F-16s or something more modern from the United States arsenal. That's a pretty good deal. Even though they're Soviet-era, we're still flying Soviet-era airplanes as well. So if we can get equipment, lethal means, especially for air reinforcement to the Ukrainians, they've been pretty good at air defense on their own. They just need the gear and the equipment. Doesn't matter that it's a little bit old. They need to take control of their skies. If we're not going to do it, we being the United Nations or NATO.
The latest we've heard of the situation there, a senior U.S. military official says about 95% of the combat power that Russia had initially lined up along the border for all those weeks has now been moved into Ukraine. We know this invasion is taking longer than Russia planned, but how much longer do you think Ukraine can continue to hold out and fight?
Well, Ukraine can hold out for quite a long time. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan with overwhelming superior numbers, forces, equipment, logistics. The United States was bogged down for 20 years, both in Baghdad and Kabul. And as you could see, the harassment, the interdiction, the guerrilla warfare, insurrection can go on for decades. What the Russians did was gambled that this would be a quick strike. They would get in there and cause the government to flee, install a pro-Putin government. That did not happen. Now they're stretched out. They have to supply every one of those tanks with fuel. They have to supply the troops with food, medical aid. That gets difficult, especially in the interior portions. So that's why you're seeing a lot more successes in the east, which was already sort of under nominal Soviet or Russian control, the Donbass region, and in the south, where they can supply from Crimea and from the ocean. That's another thing the United States can do, is patrolling the high seas outside the Dardanelles Straits in Turkey and in the Black Sea. We've got American vessels that are steaming from the Med that direction, and that's a good way to put pressure on Putin.
All right, Jason Beardsley, thanks so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Now, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine was the main topic on Sunday's Meet the Press. Secretary of State Antony Blinken joined to discuss the next steps in the U.S. response. And West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin said nothing is off the table when it comes to war. Moderator Chuck Todd has more in this week's Meet the Press Compressed.
Let's start with planes. It seems that we're close. This idea of essentially U.S. fighter jets to Poland. In exchange, Poland says Russian-made jets to Ukraine. Is that going to happen? And how quickly can it happen?
We're talking very actively about this, looking at what we could do to backfill Poland if it chooses to send the MiGs and the Su planes that it has to Ukraine. how we can help by backfilling what they're giving to the Ukrainians. So that's in very active discussion as we speak.
Would you support a no-fly zone? Would you support doing this, which could trigger a wider conflict?
I understand that, but right now you don't signal to the nemesis of Putin. This is Putin's war. This is not the Russian people's war. This is Putin's war and his quest for whatever it may be. But to take anything off the table thinking we might not be able to use things because we've already taken them off the table is wrong. I would take nothing off the table.
Well, one can argue that there's been 20 years of appeasing Putin, that there was this belief that he could be part of the world order. Was that a mistake from the get-go?
No, I've always said that you cannot trust Russia. You cannot trust Putin. You can't trust Xi. You can't trust China. It's common sense. I dealt with them at the United Nations. You never negotiate. You never deal with your enemies. You can't trust them. I was mortified that Biden went so far as asking China for help with Russia. I mean, you never ask an enemy for help with another enemy.
Logistically, how doable is this? And why are so many folks in the United States adamant about not even attempting it?
Let me start with the back end, because I think it's really the important question. It's quite obvious that if we put U.S. NATO jets in the air enforcing a no-fly zone, they'll be going nose to nose with Russian fighter aircraft. Down that path, the potential for miscalculation in a war between NATO and Russia and a war between Russia and the United States rises significantly. Look, I implemented a no-fly zone. I know how to do this. I did it in Libya in 2011. Can we do it? Sure. Should we? Not yet. But final point, Chuck, what we ought to do is give the Ukrainians the ability to create a no-fly zone, more Stingers, more missiles that can go higher than Stingers, and above all, consummate this fighter deal, get those MiG-29s in their hands.
Welcome back. Refugees are streaming out of Ukraine as fighting intensifies around several key cities. More of our coverage out of Ukraine is coming up, but first, some other stories making news today.
Yeah, there's big news on the COVID front here in New York City this morning. First, masks are no longer required in the classroom. Starting today, teachers and kids 5 and up won't have to wear them. Also today, vaccination requirements to get into places like gyms and restaurants are being lifted. These big changes come as hospitalizations drop in New York from their January highs during the spread of the Omicron variant. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen joins us now from Robert F. Wagner Middle School on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Ron, good morning. So walk us through exactly what parents, students, and teachers need to know about these changes to the city's mask policies inside schools. What's happening when they turn up where you are today?
Well, the big word, Savannah, I think is optional. They're no longer required to wear masks, but you can if you want to. That applies to teachers and students. And as you said, this is K to 12. It's not 5 and under because the kids under 5 haven't been vaccinated. And that's frustrating some parents that they're not vaccinated and frustrating some parents that they still have to wear masks. But this is a big step. You know, when you think about it, it's been over a year since kids have been wearing masks to school, and of course 2 years going back when schools were shut down entirely. So this is a sign, a huge sign of progress that things are moving forward. The mayor sees this as a moment to celebrate, as a moment to say that New York is opening, that things are getting back to normal. And as you look around the city, there are more and more people out. Businesses are open, restaurants are open, theaters are open. Things are, quote unquote, getting back to some level of normalcy. And the numbers, of course, are very low. The infection rates, the number of hospitalizations, the number of COVID cases is way down. And we're seem to be very much past the whole Omicron surge that happened through the holidays when you got to the point where just about everybody knew somebody who was sick. Here's how Mayor Adams explained his rationale for lifting the mask mandate in schools. Take a listen.
The great part of this, you know, I know you missed it and I missed it. We want to see the faces of our children. We want to see their smiles. We want to see how happy they are. We want to see when they're feeling sad so that we can be there to comfort them. And the mask prevented us from doing so for almost 2 years. And it's happy to see those smiles again.
So we'll see how it goes. You know, talking to parents and students over the weekend, people are not rushing into this. I think everyone's sort of walking into it slowly to see how you feel. I know, for example, my daughter said that she wants to keep her mask on. She's an 8th grader. You know, habits are hard to break, and there's still this caution, but we'll see as the day goes on. I suspect that as people get tired of wearing a mask during the day when they have the option to take it off, they probably will. Right. But as with all these things, you know, going to a theater, going to a restaurant, going to do any other thing, I think it'll be a day-to-day thing.
Yeah, Ron, let's talk more about that, about going to these other places. So this other big piece of news is that most of these restrictions, most of these mandates in place are going away now when it comes to showing proof of vaccination to get into public spaces. I think, especially here in New York, we're very used to having to have our vaccine card and ID ready to get into a restaurant, but that seems like it's not going to be the case. What should people know about these changes, and also what rules are still in effect?
Well, this is a big thing for the restaurant industry, which has been battered, obviously, during the whole pandemic. Yes, you no longer have to show proof of vaccination to get into a restaurant or a theater or a gym. There are some exceptions like Broadway and public transit, buses and subways. You still have to, airports, you still have to wear a mask in those venues. But the vaccination thing with restaurants, yes, that has been lifted. There is still a public and private employer mandate. So if you work here in the city, as we do, you still have to be vaccinated to go to work. The same is in the public sector, teachers and bus drivers and so forth. And there have been, I think, about 1,400 public employees, a very small percentage who were fired, who didn't do that. But the bottom line is, yes, things are changing, the restrictions are easing, and you know, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it's over. But again, we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully it's over. Isn't that right? Ron Allen, thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel for more on this. Dr. Patel, good to have you with us. So with these COVID protocols dropping, what are your biggest worries? Are you concerned people will no longer feel the need to get vaccinated or get boosters, or is that ship sailed already?
Yeah, Joe, I worry a bit that ship has sailed. However, I do think that if we get an Omicron-specific booster and some incredible data, and then obviously if a new variant emerges for which that vaccine becomes more useful, I do think we'll have people responding, because we had a lot of people that wanted it in the first place, just not enough, unfortunately. And then the second thing I'm concerned about are, you know, the groups that just can't get that protection now that masks are coming off. It is a great time to enjoy yourself. Viral activity is at an all-time record low since the surge started, but it's still out there. And I think if you're under 5 or you haven't been vaccinated, or if you're in that immunocompromised group or in the household of one, I know there's a lot of concern out there.
Let's talk about kids under 5. They still don't have access to COVID vaccines. Is there a fear that younger kids are getting left behind as we roll back these protocols? And do we have any update on when those vaccines might actually be authorized for that age group?
Yeah, absolutely a fear, especially the anxiety among parents. I do want to reassure parents that there are steps that they can take to protect their children under 5. Definitely having as many of the household and staff and faculty around them in daycare and childcare settings, vaccinated and boosted if possible, will help tremendously. But also on top of that, having even just your child wearing, even if it's not a great mask, a fabric mask, and making sure that you talk to childcare settings about air circulation. It's getting warm. We can prop windows. We can put in those filtration systems that are not very expensive to keep kids safe. That actually can help. And Joe, viral activity levels are very low, as I mentioned. Good news all around. In terms of vaccines for children, we need better updates from the FDA. We just got that kind of halt in information in February, but we're looking at hopefully Pfizer getting their 3rd shot data at earliest by mid to late March, certainly by April, putting shots in arms probably by late April, maybe early May. We're also keeping an eye on Moderna, which is also set to show data in a younger population, the 2 to 5 age set. So I hope we can have all of that come forward and have some options in the next month.
Speaking of vaccines, very quickly, Novavax says it was able to fix the manufacturing issues that led to delays in its FDA authorization application. The FDA now resuming its review. Is this important to have this vaccine?
It is. It's a different option. It's traditional kind of protein-developed vaccines that remind us of hepatitis and other types of vaccines that we're commonly used to using. And we think that can help maybe for some people who believe that the messenger RNA vaccines, Joe, are just too new in their opinion. We know that's not fact, but we respect opinions that prevent people from getting vaccines, and offer them options is a great idea.
All right. Thank you for explaining that. Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you so much.
Now, a WNBA superstar is in custody in Russia this morning after being arrested on drug charges and reportedly detained for several weeks now. Her arrest may have larger implications as tensions escalate with the U.S. after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. Here's NBC News correspondent Kathy Park.
Brittney Griner is a star basketball player in the U.S., but she is making international headlines after being arrested in Russia on drug charges. And now there are growing calls for her release. Growing concerns over WNBA star and two-time Olympic gold medalist Brittney Griner, arrested by Russian federal customs officials on drug charges. This weekend, they released a video showing a traveler believed to be Griner going through airport security, followed by a closer inspection of her suitcase. The Customs Service saying they found vape cartridges containing hash oil, an offense which could carry a 10-year prison sentence.
So how worried should we be about Brittney's well-being right now?
Unfortunately, Kathy, I think we should be really worried. Once they figured out who she was, given the timing and everything that's happening right now, it's undeniable that she's now being held as part of the pawn in this geopolitical standoff and in the war in Ukraine.
Her arrest comes amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and Russia as a war in Ukraine enters another week. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, when asked about Griner, said,
"Whenever an American is detained anywhere in the world, we, of course, stand ready to provide every possible assistance, and that includes in Russia."
The 31-year-old center with the Phoenix Mercury has played in Russia during the last 7 years during the NBA offseason. Her team tweeting, "Our main concern is her safety, physical and mental health." With reports Griner has been detained for weeks, Griner's wife posted, "This message comes during one of the weakest moments of my life. We continue to work on getting my wife home safely." And according to the New York Times, a WNBA spokesperson says that aside from Griner, all players in the league are now out of Russia and Ukraine. Back to you.
All right, Kathy Park, thank you.
Let's get a check on your morning news now. Weather.
Deadly tornadoes hit Iowa over the weekend, and at least 7 people, including 2 children, were killed. NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns joins us with the latest. Hey, Bill.
Yeah, it was a dangerous weekend, and our thoughts are with all the people in Iowa, and even Arkansas had a couple yesterday that people had to clean up from. But the one in Iowa was a powerful tornado. I mean, that's a wedge tornado. Estimated to be like an EF3, so winds are excess of 150 miles per hour. That's the kind that just tears apart buildings and trees, just anything in its path. We know we had 7 fatalities, and unfortunately, 2 or 3 of those were children under the age of 5. So, yeah, sad scene in Iowa over the weekend. So as we went throughout the last 24 hours since then, we did have additional tornadoes yesterday in areas of Arkansas. Now we're watching that tornado threat pushing into Tennessee, Kentucky, and northern Alabama. And on this map, we are showing blue and white is snow, the yellow is the really heavy rainfall, and you can see few lightning strikes just left over near Tupelo, but the thunderstorms have been weakening and no reported tornadoes in the last couple hours. For the rest of today, these storms will actually get stronger this afternoon. It is very warm on the eastern seaboard today, and that's all, you can almost feel it in the air. It's just unusual for this time of year, and that line of storms, when it hits that warm air, is going to form more storms. So 48 million people at risk of severe weather today. Damaging wind is the biggest concern, all the way from Pennsylvania down through the mountains of Virginia, North Carolina, and into northern Alabama and Georgia. We also have a lot of flooding going on near Indianapolis. Southern portions of Illinois has a lot of flooding everywhere in maroon, and we'll continue to watch that flood threat as we go throughout the morning. And on top of all of that, the same areas that had record highs 4 days ago are under winter weather alerts. We've had snow overnight in Kansas City, Des Moines, Chicago, Milwaukee, and we'll see a little bit additional snow, especially in areas of Michigan. We're looking at Chicago. The snow has returned for the peak of your morning rush hour. Not a lot, but about 1 to 3 inches total in the area. So especially the bridges and overpasses, be careful on those. And I mentioned the warmth, guys. 81 degrees today in our nation's capital, in New York City, has a chance of 70. So a very active, typical, changeable spring weather map.
Yeah, spring, winter, a little bit of everything. My goodness.
Yeah, wow. So crazy. 81 in D.C. Oh, my gosh. All right, Bill, thank you so much. See you in a little bit.
The Ukrainian couple fighting on the front lines traded in their helmets and weapons for a veil and bouquet this weekend. The couple, together for 22 years, officially tied the knot Sunday near Kyiv, surrounded by their fellow soldiers. Newlyweds had not seen each other since joining Ukraine's territorial defense force at the start of the invasion. But they were able to enjoy this special moment together as they sipped champagne, even got a congrats from the mayor of Kyiv.
Now, more countries are announcing sanctions against Russia while the Pope is speaking out against the violence from the Vatican.
NBC News foreign correspondent Janice Mackey-Frayer joins us now from Beijing with a closer look at how the rest of the world is reacting to this unfolding situation in Ukraine. Janice, good morning.
Joe and Savannah, good morning. We do have more sanctions being announced against Russia, this time from New Zealand, and it's a first there. The country will freeze Russian assets as well. It'll prevent money being moved by individuals or companies, and they'll stop any yachts, ships, or planes with ties to Russia from entering New Zealand waters or airspace. Also, South Korea says it is severing transactions with Russia's central bank. The country saying that this will come more in line with the financial sanctions announced by the U.S. Pope Francis called for peace during his weekly address from the Vatican. He also rejected Russia's claim that this was a military operation. The pontiff said, quote, "It's a war which sows death, destruction, and misery." The Pope also thanked people who are taking in refugees and extended thanks to journalists for providing information. And finally, a case of mistaken identity is having an impact on a French-Canadian snack. Poutine is a mix of French fries, gravy, and cheese curds. It's actually quite good. But because its name sounds like Putin, the Russian leader, the House of Poutine in France says it's getting threats and insults as well. A diner in Canada says they've had to take it off the menu. First of all, because they're expressing dismay with what's going on, but also because the name is sowing some confusion.
Wow.
And that's a look at your headlines.
I second that, though. Poutine is very good. Maybe we just go with gravy, cheesy fries. For the next
Not
little
healthy
bit.
at all, but very tasty.
Thank you, Janice.
Thanks.
Now, the Biden administration is offering temporary protected status to Ukrainians who are currently living in the U.S. without legal status. This impacts roughly 30,000 Ukrainians who've been here since before March 1st. They can avoid deportation and stay and work for 18 months. Advocacy groups are applauding the move, but others are wondering why the U.S. has not moved as quickly for people from non-European countries when they've been pleading for the exact same status for months. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard has the story.
Masses of people fleeing Ukraine.
Ukraine, it's like a hell. That's why we crossed to another country.
More than 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries.
But what exactly is the U.S. prepared to actually do for those fleeing Russia's persecution in their home country?
Given the bipartisan support for Ukrainians, I think this is an opportunity to actually rebuild that pipeline.
On Thursday, the U.S. granted temporary protected status to the estimated 30,000 Ukrainians already in the country, but not here on visas.
We will be providing temporary protected status, TPS, to those Ukrainian nationals who are present in the United States as of March 1st of this year.
But the U.S. has not offered a special path for current Ukrainians to come to the U.S. as refugees. Instead, the U.S. has sent millions of dollars in aid, food, health care supplies, blankets, and deployed a disaster relief team to the region.
We're providing support to the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom. Military assistance, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance.
But this places the U.S.'s policy toward refugees and asylum seekers under scrutiny again. Over the last 6 months, the Biden administration has flown thousands of Haitians from the U.S.'s southern border to Haiti. In fiscal year 2021, the Biden administration welcomed just 11,411 refugees. When President Obama left office, the number into the U.S. each year, 110,000. By 2020, Trump had cut that number to just 15,000. President Trump even signing an order suspending admission of Syrian refugees into the U.S. during the country's long, deadly civil war.
How would you describe U.S. policy towards refugees in the last 20 years?
The United States had been a country that provided refugee resettlement to the most people in the world, and that really declined.
Welcome back. Europe is fiercely united in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with some nations reversing historic policies. The EU is vowing to support Ukraine with military assistance and humanitarian aid. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with NATO and G7 allies in Brussels on Friday. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman joins us now from the Latvian capital, Riga. Josh, good morning.
Good morning, Savannah. You know, it was not that long ago that the U.S. and Europe seemed like, try as they might, they just could not get on the same page. There were even questions about the future of the NATO alliance, but so much has changed in such a short period of time. These guys that you see behind me are paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They're based out of Italy, but some of them have been deployed here to Latvia as NATO shores up its defenses and shows that it is united. All of this coming as the West is really stepping up with an unprecedented diplomatic front, putting pressure on Russia and showing that U.S. and Europe are standing together. Take a look.
Outside European Parliament, a moment of solemn solidarity and of newfound resolve. Ukraine and Europe standing as one. This Ukrainian woman pleading for help for her homeland.
Yes, my brother, my sister, my cousins, my mom, my dad, they're all in Kyiv. In Kyiv. And you know what? They even don't want to evacuate because it's their home, it's my home.
It wasn't always like this. In a matter of days, Russian President Vladimir Putin has unintentionally pulled off what no other leader has in decades: unite Europe and the West around a common threat.
The message from Europe is clear. We will stand up. We will not look away when those fighting in the streets for our values face down Putin's massive war machine.
For years, Europe has been reluctant to directly confront Russia, a nuclear-armed power 4 times larger in size than the EU. Now that reluctance is melting away in what's being called a sea change that may outlive this conflict.
Literally, what seemed impossible became possible within 24 hours. And again, this is all the credit to Vladimir Putin.
Germany now taking a leading military role for the first time since World War II. Chancellor Olaf Scholz announcing Germany will send lethal weapons to Ukraine and spend more on its own military, saying the new reality requires a clear response.
They basically shed 70 years worth of policy towards Russia in a matter of days.
Europe financing up to $500 million of deadly weaponry for Ukraine for the first time and barring Russian planes from European airspace. And Sweden, Switzerland, and Finland breaking their long-standing neutrality to confront Putin. Western nations squeezing Russia with sanctions that could hurt their own economies. And just a few weeks ago seemed too heavy a lift. Freezing Russia's $11 billion Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a critical gas supply for Europe, and kicking major Russian banks out of the SWIFT global financial system. All told, it's the most sweeping set of economic, travel, and diplomatic penalties ever imposed on Russia, as communities across the West rise up to defend common values that have suddenly come into focus. This moment of unity in Europe is also felt here at NATO. Just a few years ago, the NATO alliance seemed more frayed than ever. Former President Trump was even threatening to pull out. But Putin's war has given NATO fresh purpose.
I'd like to commend President Biden and the U.S. for stepping up with more troops, with more presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
It's an early payoff for President Biden's strategy of letting Europe take the lead, denying Putin the chance to make this about the U.S. against Russia.
I spent countless hours unifying our European allies. We shared with the world in advance what we knew Putin was planning. And now that he's acted, the free world is holding him accountable.
President Zelensky imploring Europeans not to abandon his nation, calling this war the price of freedom.
Ми довели свою силу, довели, що ми, як мінімум, такі самі, як ви. Доведіть, що ви разом з нами.
And Savannah, they say half the battle is just showing up. And to that end, U.S. officials are fanning out across this region to show that they are standing one with their European allies. Secretary of State Antony Blinken just arrived this morning here in Latvia on a trip that's bringing him to all three Baltic nations, as well as to Moldova, where he was in the last few days, talking about the influx of refugees there. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, also in Lithuania in the last couple of days, and Vice President Kamala Harris expected to visit two NATO allies, Poland and Romania, to try to show her support. Savannah?
All right, Josh Letterman, thank you so much. And we now want to go to someone on the ground in Ukraine. As 1.5 million Ukrainians have fled their country in search of safety, many remain in their home cities. That includes Veronica Melzerkova. She's the executive editor of the New Voice of Ukraine, and she joins us now from Kyiv. Veronica, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So, this has been going on for almost 2 weeks now. Tell us how things are on the ground in Kyiv, where you are, how they've changed, and really just about your decision to remain there in Kyiv as this unfolds.
Hello, thank you for having me. I decided to stay in Kyiv because I need to take care of my elderly grandma and my husband's parents. So they won't make it if we travel, for example, for Western Ukraine. Therefore, I have to stay. A lot of elderly people are left in Kyiv, so we have to help them too. During the recent 2 weeks, Kyiv has changed drastically. I can see that the capital is preparing for the Russian invasion. Many checkpoints are all across the city. We can see military vehicles going in different directions. From my window where I am now, I can see the evacuation trains and I can hear them going back and forth. Russians are getting closer to the capital. Right now, heavy fights are going on in Irpin, Hostomel, Bucha, and Borodyanka, which are all localities, towns, and villages of Kyiv Oblast. Right there, many people are trapped in the basements because Russians have partly occupied Irpin and Hostomel, and they don't let people out. They even killed a mayor of Hostomel who was giving bread and medicine to people who were in need. Hostomel city. So everything is very intense in Kyiv. People are suffering.
Oh, absolutely. Veronica Melzerkova, we're thinking of you and your family that we know that you are sticking around for and with. We appreciate your time. We're thinking about you, and we'll check in with you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Now, the conflict in Ukraine is creating concern over the world's fuel supply. Overnight, the cost of oil shot up to its highest price in over a decade.
NBC's Silvana now joins us with more on how the conflict in Ukraine is impacting the world's energy market. Silvana, good morning.
Hey guys, good morning. That's right. And oil prices spiking overnight to 13-year highs on worries about global supply disruptions. The U.S. and European allies are considering a possible ban on imports of Russian oil and natural gas. U.S. and Brent crude both briefly topping $130 a barrel. That's the highest since the summer of 2008. Russia is the world's second largest oil producer and largest exporter of natural gas to Europe. Last year, the U.S. imported roughly 20 million barrels a month of crude oil and refined products from Russia. That's about 8% of our total liquid fuel imports. And those surging oil prices are trickling down to the gas pump. The price of regular unleaded topping $4 on average nationwide this weekend. AAA saying the current average is $4.06 a gallon. That's up 45 cents from just a week ago and $1.30 from this time a year ago. Gas Buddy says as the war in Ukraine evolves and we move into spring and summer driving season, Americans should be prepared to pay more to fill up than ever before. This all is feeding into more negative sentiment on Wall Street. The Dow, Nasdaq, and S&P 500 are coming off weekly losses. Traders say investors aren't selling off everything, instead rotating out of growth stocks and Europe to more defensive and safe haven assets. Those include U.S. bonds, the dollar, and gold, which is topping $2,000 an ounce for the first time since 2020, guys.
Right.
Silvana, thank you so much.
You got it.
AAA says gas in 9 states is now on average more than $4 a gallon. NBC News Now anchor Hallie Jackson takes a closer look at the pain at the pump.
It seems like every day it gets a little more expensive to top off the tank.
It's usually like, oh, $30. Yeah, no, it was definitely like 45.
But why? It all has to do with the basic economic concept, supply and demand. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine front and center, Russia is the world's 3rd biggest oil producer, and prices are up because of concerns about how its war against Ukraine could disrupt its oil supply. After Russia invaded Ukraine back in February, the U.S. slapped sanctions against the Russian economy. And while they didn't put full sanctions in place against the energy industry, they did take some smaller measures. And because of question marks about Russia's ability to ship oil, some buyers have been scared away, meaning less supply and higher prices. There's another piece of this, too. Oil prices started rising before the invasion with COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, when people were in lockdown and staying home, the demand for oil dropped a lot. With so much supply, prices dropped too, big time. At one point in April of 2020, dipping below zero. Keep in mind, the crude oil price makes up only a fraction of what you actually pay at the pump. Look at 2 months ago. A barrel of crude in the U.S. cost $83 on average. Break it down per gallon, that's $1.98. But you were paying more than that because you have to add in the cost of taxes, distribution, marketing, refining, which is why the price at the pump then was on average $3.41. Now it's $3.84, with real questions about how high it gets next.
The world is coming together to show its support for Ukraine by displaying not just the country's flag, but the nation's official flower.
It's a sunflower, and they've become a symbol of unity and a message of love for Ukrainians everywhere. NBC Weekend Nightly News anchor Jose Diaz-Balart has more.
Amid the darkness of war, a global symbol of solidarity has emerged. Sunflowers representing unity with Ukraine. The nation's official flower, now taking a special place in the hearts of those desperate to help Ukrainians under attack. Like at Bedner's Farm in Boynton Beach, Florida. This weekend, donating profits from all sunflower sales to the Global Empowerment Mission helping Ukrainian refugees.
We feel how much those people are hurting and what they're struggling with. We want to do our part as farmers to help them.
In Reno, prayers and protests by those determined to make a difference.
We want to show our love for the people of Ukraine. We come here in peace to show that we care.
The movement sowing support in Virginia with free seed packets at Beaver Dam Sunflower Farm.
Just one little step to say, hey, you know, we're thinking of you. We're kind of in this together.
Together across oceans, too. Crowds threading sunflowers through barriers at the Russian embassy in London. A silent plea for peace. Worldwide, they're also a sign of hope on social media. So many posting pictures and heartfelt messages echoing across the internet, like sunflowers in support of Ukraine and praying for peace. The flowers, a source of comfort. It's in the artwork students made for their Ukrainian teacher at a Missouri school.
We're trying to show her that we love and support her.
Across the miles, signs of strength and loyalty to let Ukrainians near and far know they are not alone.
I think every single sunflower in my school represents love and support. It was a shower of sunflowers. It was a shower of love.
Our thanks to Jose Diaz-Balart for that beautiful story.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.